Bandar Abbas sits on the northern edge of the Strait of Hormuz, and for most of its history it has been known for one thing: moving cargo. It handles something like 85% of all the container traffic that enters and leaves Iran by sea. It is also home to the headquarters of the Iranian Navy. In the last 2 weeks of July 2026, it became something else entirely: the epicenter of a bombing campaign aimed not at ships, not at missile silos, but at the bridges and highways that connect that port to the rest of the country. This is the story of how a fight over a shipping lane turned into a systematic dismantling of Iranian infrastructure, and what both sides are saying about it right now. To understand why the United States military was hitting bridges in southern Iran this summer, you have to go back to February 28, 2026. That is the date most timelines mark as the start of what is now being called the 2026 Iran War. On that day, the United States and Israel carried out a coordinated series of airstrikes across Iran. Among the targets, and among the dead, was Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader for more than 3 decades. Alongside him, a large number of Iranian military and government officials were killed, and a significant amount of military infrastructure was destroyed. Iran's response was immediate and, in economic terms, enormous. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps effectively shut the Strait of Hormuz to foreign shipping, broadcasting warnings over VHF radio that no vessel would be permitted to pass. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil moves through that strait in normal times. When it closes, or even threatens to, global energy markets feel it within hours. The economic fallout from that closure was immediate and, by several measures, historic. According to a Congressional Research Service report on the conflict, roughly 27% of the world's maritime trade in crude, oil, and petroleum products normally passes through the Strait of Hormuz, alongside significant volumes of natural gas, helium, and fertilizer. When Iran formally declared the strait closed on March 4th, Brent crude prices, which had been trading in the low 70s just days earlier, surged past $80 a barrel within roughly 5 trading days, according to market coverage at the time, and Britannica's own tally puts the average March price at around $103 a barrel. The International Energy Agency described the resulting disruption as the largest the global oil market has ever seen, language that Wikipedia's ongoing summary of the war's economic impact also cites directly from the IEA. Qatar Energy declared force majeure on its exports. Combined oil production from Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE reportedly dropped by more than 10 million barrels a day within 2 weeks of the closure. The ripple effects reached as far as Vietnam, where reporting cited by Wikipedia's summary describes fuel shortages and panic buying at gas stations thousands of miles from the Persian Gulf. A separate analysis published by the Center for Economic Policy Research estimated that even under a relatively optimistic scenario, the war's effect on oil prices alone could push U.S. headline inflation up by roughly 0.6 of a percentage point in 2026. None of that is background noise to the bridge strikes. It's the reason the strait and the port city that anchors it became a military target in the first place. It's also worth noting this wasn't the first time Iran, Israel, and the United States had come to blows in recent memory. Coverage of the run-up to the 2026 war, including a market analysis published by Financial Content, traces the immediate roots of this conflict to the collapse of nuclear negotiations in Geneva in early 2025, and to what's been called the 12-Day War in June 2025. When Israel launched a campaign referred to as Operation Rising Lion against Iranian nuclear facilities. A ceasefire held through that following winter, but by February 28, 2026, it had broken down entirely, setting the stage for the assassination of Khamenei and everything that followed. For the next several weeks, the conflict ground on, until, on April 8th, Pakistan brokered a 2-week ceasefire between Washington and Tehran. According to the Wikipedia page tracking that specific ceasefire, the stated goals on the table at the time went well beyond just pausing the fighting. They included ending the broader Iran war outright, separately winding down a parallel conflict in Lebanon, and reopening the Strait of Hormuz for good. Iran and Pakistan both described the Lebanon component as part of the deal. Israel and the United States denied that the two conflicts were formally linked. The ceasefire's outcome, as that same page summarizes it, was a temporary 2-week pause followed by the collapse of follow-up talks held in Islamabad, after which the United States moved to impose the naval blockade on Iran that, in modified form, is still partially in place today. Numerous outlets covering the region, including Wikipedia's continuously updated conflict page and Britannica's ongoing timeline, mark this as the first real pause in the fighting. But a ceasefire is not the same as peace, and this one was fragile from the start. Trump had written on his social media platform in early March that there would be no deal with Iran except unconditional surrender. Language that gives you a sense of how far apart the two sides were even while a truce was technically in effect. By early April, with the Strait of Hormuz still not fully reopened, President Trump began threatening a new category of target: civilian infrastructure. According to reporting picked up by India's public broadcaster and by Gulf News, Trump warned on April 5th that if the strait remained closed, the U.S. would begin striking Iran's power plants and bridges starting April 7th. The entire country can be taken out in one night, he said, according to Gulf News' coverage of the threat. Iranian officials responded by urging young people to form human chains around power plants in an attempt to physically shield them, a detail that made international headlines at the time. France's Foreign Minister, Jean-Noël Barrot, pushed back publicly, saying that strikes on civilian and energy infrastructure would violate the rules of war under international law. When the April 7th deadline arrived and the strikes went forward, the damage was concentrated on transportation infrastructure rather than population centers, though the toll was still real. Iran's state news agency, IRNA, reported that a railway bridge near the city of Kashan in central Iran was hit, killing 2 people and injuring 3. Separately, the Karaj B1 bridge, described in regional coverage as the tallest bridge in the Middle East and a critical route out of Tehran to the west, was struck repeatedly over several days. Casualty figures for those specific strikes, drawn from local reporting at the time, ranged between 8 and 13 killed and as many as 95 wounded, a number that reportedly included civilians who had gathered near the structure. A highway bridge connecting Tabriz to Zanjan in Iran's north was also hit and shut down. It's worth being direct here. These April casualty figures come from Iranian and regional reporting rather than from U.S. military statements, and they have not been independently verified by a Western wire service in the same way other parts of this story have been. We're including them because they are consistently cited across multiple regional outlets, but the caveat matters. That spring campaign was reportedly part of a broader operation that U.S. and Israeli officials referred to, in various contexts, as an intensification of military action against Iranian missile production and logistics tied to the regime, beginning in earnest in late February. Whatever name gets attached to it, the pattern by April was already visible. Bridges and energy infrastructure were no longer off the table. Then came another attempt at de-escalation. In June 2026, the two sides reached a memorandum of understanding, an agreement aimed at ending the broader war and reopening the Strait of Hormuz to commercial traffic. For a few weeks, it seemed to be holding, or at least holding well enough that the story dropped out of the daily headlines. That changed on July 6th and 7th when 3 ships were attacked while transiting waters connected to the strait. According to Britannica's ongoing account of the war, President Trump responded by declaring that, as far as he was concerned, the truce was over. He initially suggested the exchange of fire wouldn't necessarily lead to sustained military action, but within days, it clearly had. By late July, the campaign had escalated sharply. On July 30th, after a 5-night pause in U.S. strikes, CENTCOM, U.S. Central Command, announced what it called a heavy wave of attacks on Iran. Al Jazeera, citing CENTCOM's own statement, reported the strikes were launched in direct response to an Iranian missile attack on a U.S. base in Jordan the day before. Iranian state media said 3 civilians were killed in that round. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps said 3 of its own personnel were killed as well. That wasn't the first time Trump had publicly floated a specific named target ahead of a strike. CNN's ongoing coverage of the war notes that, back on June 11th, Trump said the U.S. military would be hitting Iran very hard that night and would also be taking Karg Island and other oil infrastructure points. A reference to Karg Island, which sits in the Persian Gulf and handles the overwhelming majority of Iran's crude oil export capacity. That threat came months before the late July campaign against Bandar Abbas, but it establishes the same pattern that would show up again in July and August. Trump naming a piece of Iranian infrastructure publicly, often on social media or in a television interview, before U.S. forces actually struck it. The naval dimension of this conflict matters here too, because the bridges around Bandar Abbas weren't hit in isolation. They were hit as part of a broader effort to control the waterway itself. Wikipedia's summary of the broader Strait of Hormuz crisis lists, among the outcomes of the conflict so far, a formal U.S. naval blockade of Iran, a separate U.S. naval escort operation intended to shepherd commercial vessels safely through contested waters, and the formation of what's been described as a Persian Gulf Strait Authority, an arrangement among regional and allied states aimed at managing shipping traffic through the strait going forward. None of that infrastructure existed before this year. It's a sign of just how much permanent fueling apparatus has been built around a waterway that, as of this week, still hasn't fully reopened to normal commercial traffic. From there, the campaign against infrastructure specifically began. On what CENTCOM itself described as the 6th and then the 7th consecutive night of strikes, U.S. forces began systematically targeting bridges, energy infrastructure, and a port facility in southern Iran. The Washington Post, citing Iranian state media, reported that the U.S. hit bridges, energy targets, and a port facility overnight, while Kuwaiti authorities confirmed that Iran had retaliated by striking a power and desalination plant inside Kuwait. NBC News reported that CENTCOM posted directly to social media confirming the operation. writing that it had launched a round of strikes against Iran at 3 p.m. Eastern Time for the 7th consecutive night, and that the strikes were, in CENTCOM's own words, designed to continue degrading Iranian military capabilities at the commander-in-chief's direction. CENTCOM said the operation concluded around 9:30 that evening and specified that it had hit surveillance sites, military logistics, infrastructure, underground weapon storage, and what it called maritime capabilities, using fighter aircraft, aerial drones, and warships. The geography of the campaign is where Bandar Abbas comes back into the picture. NBC News reported that this expanded phase of the operation appeared specifically aimed at cutting off Bandar Abbas, again, the port city that serves as headquarters for the Iranian Navy and handles the vast majority of the country's container traffic from the rest of the country. The Hill's coverage adds more texture here. Strikes landed in Bandar Kamir, a smaller port city west of Bandar Abbas in Iran's Hormozgan province, hitting a major bridge and igniting a fire. On Fox News, retired four-star Army General Jack Keane explained the strategic logic behind targeting river crossings and highway bridges rather than, say, population centers. Isolating the Strait of Hormuz was always part of the plan, Keane said, arguing that destroying bridges prevented Iran from reinforcing the area logistically or rebuilding capabilities the U.S. had already degraded. He added that Iran could still harass commercial shipping to a limited degree, but that the U.S. had the ability to systematically remove Iran's means of controlling the waterway. Iran's state broadcaster, IRIB, reported that strikes hit in and around Bandar Abbas on the Thursday before that 7th night of attacks, and that several bridges and highways connecting the port hub to surrounding provinces had been closed as a result. That's a claim from Iranian state media specifically, and it lines up with what CENTCOM and Western outlets were independently reporting about the campaign's targets, even if the two sides frame the operation very differently. It's worth pausing on something. The Hill's reporting flagged directly. Critics of the campaign, cited in that same coverage, have noted that striking infrastructure not being actively used for military purposes could raise questions under the laws of war, potentially constituting war crimes, if the targets in question were genuinely civilian in nature. The U.S. military's own position, expressed through CENTCOM's statements, has consistently been that the targets are tied to military logistics and Iran's capacity to project force through the strait, that the bridges matter because they're used to move weapons and reinforcements, not because they're purely civilian infrastructure. This is a real point of disagreement between the Pentagon's framing and how outside legal critics are characterizing the same strikes, and it hasn't been resolved by any independent investigation as of this recording. This is also where Trump's public rhetoric becomes directly relevant, because he had been signaling this exact shift in targeting for weeks. Al Jazeera reported that Trump had posted a warning stating that any time Iran fired on a vessel in the Strait of Hormuz, the U.S. would bomb and destroy one bridge or power plant, explicitly including targets located in or near Tehran, the capital. In a separate interview with Fox News correspondent Trey Yingst, cited by The Hill, Trump previewed the escalation in blunter terms. "We're going to hit them very hard tonight. We're going to hit them very hard tomorrow night. We're going to hit them very hard the night after, and then next week it gets really bad for them," he said, adding, "because next week comes the power plants. Next week comes the bridges." Whatever your view of that kind of public signaling from a sitting president, it matches almost exactly what CENTCOM went on to execute in the days that followed. It's a pattern worth sitting with for a second. A president naming infrastructure targets on live television or on social media days or weeks before the strikes happen, followed by CENTCOM confirming, in far more clinical language, that those same categories of target, bridges, power plants, port facilities were in fact hit. Whether that public telegraphing is meant as a deterrent aimed at Tehran, a signal to allies, or simply Trump's characteristic style of narrating his own decisions before they happen, it has, in this case, tracked closely with what actually followed on the ground near Bandar Abbas and Bandar Kamir alike. Iran did not absorb this campaign without responding. Kuwait's Foreign Affairs Ministry condemned Iranian strikes on Gulf states as what it called a flagrant violation of sovereignty, expressing solidarity with Kuwait and other regional states affected by the fallout. Saudi Arabia's foreign ministry issued a similar condemnation, calling for an immediate halt to military escalation and a return to dialogue. Iran, for its part, said through Major General Ali Abdullahi, head of its wartime military command, that the United States was, in his words, moving at an accelerating pace to fan the flames of a full-scale regional war, and accused Washington of using the capital and infrastructure of neighboring Gulf states as a shield for its own military interests while strengthening Israel's position. Kuwait and Saudi Arabia weren't the only Gulf states caught in the crossfire earlier in the war. Back in late February, following the initial joint U.S.-Israeli strikes that killed Khamenei, Iran launched a series of ballistic and drone attacks against the United Arab Emirates, according to a Wikipedia summary of that specific incident, aimed primarily at American assets and bases stationed there. Those attacks killed 3 foreign workers, nationals of Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh, and injured 58 others, a reminder that a large share of the casualties in this war, from its opening days through the Bandar Abbas campaign in July, have fallen on migrant laborers, shipping crews, and civilians with no direct role in the conflict, rather than on combatants themselves. The broader Strait of Hormuz crisis has produced its own separate toll on shipping. 1 tugboat sunk, at least 17 merchant vessels damaged, 7 of which were reportedly abandoned by their crews, 2 merchant ships captured outright, and 12 seafarers killed or reported missing, according to figures compiled in an ongoing account of the crisis. On the human costs specifically tied to American forces, the numbers are tracked through the Pentagon's own Defense Casualty Analysis System, known as DCAS. As of early August, according to CNN's review of that database, 18 U.S. optics. Troops have been killed and 687 wounded since the war began on February 28th. Of that total, 4 deaths and 270 woundings are attributed specifically to the renewed fighting from July 7th onward, meaning the campaign against Bandar Abbas and its surrounding infrastructure sits inside a period that has already cost American service members real casualties, not just Iranian ones. One of those losses was given a name and a face in Pentagon reporting. 28-year-old Angel Rampersad, identified by the Pentagon as the 3rd fatality from an Iranian missile strike on a U.S. base in Jordan, after being reported missing in the immediate aftermath of that attack. That toll hasn't gone unnoticed at home either. Wikipedia's page tracking domestic reaction to the war notes that hundreds of protesters gathered outside the White House as early as late February in the immediate aftermath of the strikes that killed Khamenei, with demonstrations both supporting and opposing the administration's actions continuing in various U.S. cities in the months since. Those protests haven't dominated headlines the way the fighting in the Gulf has, but they're part of the same story. A war that started with the assassination of a foreign head of state and has since drawn in American troops, Gulf shipping lanes, and now specifically, the bridges connecting one of Iran's busiest ports to the rest of the country. By early August, the picture on the ground had shifted again, this time toward negotiation rather than escalation, though nothing about it looks fully settled. CNN reported on August 1st that President Trump had actually canceled a planned new wave of strikes on Iran after, according to Trump's own account, Iran and unspecified other Middle Eastern countries asked him to hold off. Sources told CNN that Trump had spoken with Saudi officials in the lead-up to that decision. That doesn't mean the campaign simply ended. U.S. officials had announced plans for strikes as recently as that weekend, and the precise scope of any future action remained officially undetermined, with officials cautioning at the time that the strikes could still be called off entirely, which is essentially what happened. Since then, the story has moved toward the negotiating table, at least in the framing. Both sides are using publicly. Al Jazeera's live coverage from August 2nd and 3rd tracked talks between the U.S. and Tehran, with Trump saying negotiations were set to begin and later describing the moment as a last chance for a deal. By August 4th, CNN reported Trump striking an optimistic tone in a Fox News interview, saying very good discussions were underway, while also warning that if Iran backed out of its commitments, they are going to get hit really hard. Iran, notably, has publicly denied that it is holding any direct talks with the United States at all. Instead, Tehran's position, relayed through spokesperson Ismail Bagheri and Iran's state news agency IRNA, is that it is working with Oman, the other country bordering the Strait of Hormuz, on an arrangement to establish safe inbound and outbound shipping routes, while protecting both nations' sovereignty and security interests. As of August 6th, the most recent developments available, both Britannica's continuously updated conflict page and Fox News' live coverage describe the U.S. and Iran as saying they are close to a deal specifically on reopening the Strait of Hormuz, but not necessarily close to ending the underlying blockade or the war itself. CBS News reported that a full reopening of the strait would require the United States to end its naval blockade, and, according to Iranian officials cited in that reporting, withdraw forces from the region altogether, a condition that hasn't been confirmed as accepted by Washington. In the meantime, actual shipping traffic through the strait remains a fraction of normal levels. Citing data from the maritime tracking firm Kepler, CBS reported that only 8 ships crossed the strait on the Tuesday before that report, and just 29 over the entire week. Numbers that underline just how disrupted global shipping through that corridor still is, deal or no deal. The details of that near deal are still being worked out in public, in real time, which makes the coverage from this past week worth walking through directly. Iran's deputy foreign minister told reporters, according to CBS News' live coverage, that the 2 countries bordering the strait, Iran and Oman, are close to finalizing a framework specifically for commercial shipping, though he was careful to add that the agreement would not automatically reopen the waterway on its own. Separately, Fars news agency, Iran's semi-official outlet, reported that Iranian lawmakers have drafted a bill to formally regulate traffic through the strait, including restrictions on certain categories of vessels and penalties for violators, a measure currently sitting with the National Security Commission of Iran's parliament, and one that CNN's reporting describes as a separate track entirely from the Oman shipping talks. Iran's parliament speaker, who is also one of Tehran's top negotiators in this process, pushed back publicly against Trump's characterization of the negotiations this week, accusing him, in comments picked up by CNN, of engaging in what he called theater rather than genuine diplomacy. Whether that's a fair characterization or just posturing ahead of a deal both sides clearly want politically is hard to say from the outside, but it's a useful reminder that even as the bombing has paused, the rhetoric on both sides hasn't softened much. There are a few other threads worth mentioning because they show how far this conflict has spread beyond the strait itself. A Saudi official told CNN that the kingdom is bracing for what it described as multiple coordinated attacks from Iraqi militias working in tandem with Iran-aligned Houthi rebels in Yemen, and the Houthis themselves claimed responsibility for what they called a large-scale operation against Saudi forces. That Houthi threat isn't new either. Coverage from Discovery Alert's Energy Markets Desk reported that in late July 2026, Houthi militants declared a maritime embargo specifically against Saudi Arabia, aimed at the Red Sea export route Riyadh has been using as a workaround since the Strait of Hormuz closure, largely by relying on the east-west pipeline, which moves Gulf oil overland to a Red Sea terminal. That pipeline's maximum capacity, according to the same analysis, is only around 5 million barrels a day, well short of what would be needed to fully replace the strait. Energy analysts cited in that reporting have warned that a simultaneous closure of both the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait near Yemen, the other choke point the Houthis are now threatening, would eliminate both of the region's primary export routes at once, something the global market currently has no real mechanism to absorb. Separately, Iran's top Revolutionary Guard commander said this week that Tehran will continue developing its nuclear program for as long as the United States and Israel maintain their own nuclear arsenals, a statement that signals Iran's nuclear posture is not part of whatever Strait of Hormuz arrangement is being finalized with Oman. And, in a smaller but telling detail, CNN reported that Trump has privately complained that reporting on the Pentagon's dwindling munitions stockpile makes the U.S. look weak at the negotiating table, even as he's publicly insisted the country has, in his words, massive amounts of munitions on hand. So where does that leave things as of this week? The bridges around Bandar Abbas that were hit in late July remain, as far as publicly available reporting shows, unrepaired, and the broader U.S. naval blockade on Iranian ports is still in effect. Iran and the United States are each publicly signaling they want a deal on shipping through the strait, but they can't even agree on whether they're talking to each other directly. Washington describes ongoing discussions. Tehran insists it's negotiating with Oman instead. Meanwhile, the human toll keeps climbing on both sides, from the 18 American service members killed since February, to the civilian and military casualties Iran has reported from strikes on bridges in Kashan, Karaj, Tabriz, and now Bandar Abbas and Bandar Kamir. Before wrapping up, it's worth being transparent about where every piece of this actually came from, because a story with this many moving parts deserves that. The core details on the late July bombing campaign against bridges and energy infrastructure, the CENTCOM statements, the targeting of Bandar Abbas and Bandar Kamir, the 7 consecutive nights of strikes, are drawn from CENTCOM's own public statements as reported by NBC News, and from reporting by The Hill and The Washington Post, both of which cite CENTCOM directly alongside Iranian state media. The April strikes on the Karaj B1 bridge, the Tabriz Zanjan bridge, and the railway bridge near Kashan rely primarily on Iranian state and semi-official reporting, including IRNA, which we flagged specifically because those casualty figures have not been independently confirmed by a Western wire service the way the July and August developments have. Trump's public statements and social media posts are drawn from direct reporting by Al Jazeera, The Hill, and CNN. The current state of negotiations, including the Oman shipping talks and the ship traffic figures from Kapler, comes from CBS News, Fox News, and CNN's live coverage as of August 4th through 6th, along with Britannica's continuously updated timeline of the war. Where Iran's Revolutionary Guard has made claims about intercepting ships in the strait, we've noted that the U.S. military has not issued a matching confirmation, and those claims should be treated as unverified. Casualty and troop loss figures for you. S forces come from the Pentagon's own DCAS database, reviewed and reported by CNN. The economic figures, oil prices, the IEA's characterization of the disruption, the Vietnam fuel shortages, and the inflation estimates come from a Congressional Research Service report, Britannica's timeline, and a published analysis from the Center for Economic Policy Research, along with contemporaneous market reporting. Casualty figures tied to the UAE strikes and the broader Strait of Hormuz shipping crisis, along with the domestic U.S. protest activity, are drawn from continuously updated encyclopedic summaries of those specific events, which themselves cite wire service and government reporting. The Houthi threat to Red Sea shipping is reported by Discovery Alert's energy markets coverage, where any of these figures conflict or remain provisional, and in a war this active, some inevitably will, we've tried to flag it rather than present a single number as final. And it's worth repeating the one distinction that matters most across all of this. Statements from CENTCOM, the Pentagon's own casualty database, and named U.S. officials represent the American military's version of events. Statements from RNA, IRIB, and Iran's Revolutionary Guard represent Tehran's version. And where outlets like the Washington Post, NBC News, Reuters, or Al Jazeera are cited independently confirming a specific detail, that's a stronger form of confirmation than either side's account standing alone. Readers and viewers piecing together a war this fluid are better served by keeping those categories separate than by treating every number in this script as equally certain. What's clear, whatever side of this you land on, is that the war over the Strait of Hormuz stopped being just a war over shipping lanes months ago. It became a war over the physical infrastructure that connects Iran's most important port to the rest of the country, fought with fighter jets and drones over Bandar Abbas on one side, and with missiles aimed at American troops in Jordan and Iraq on the other. Whether the talks happening right now between Tehran, Washington, and Oman actually produce a lasting reopening of the strait, or just another pause before the next round of strikes, is genuinely unresolved as of this week. There's a reason bridges specifically kept coming up as targets throughout this war, beyond just their proximity to Bandar Abbas. Military analysts speaking on U.S. television, including General Keene's comments on Fox News referenced earlier, have consistently framed bridge and highway infrastructure as logistics targets rather than symbolic ones. The idea being that degrading Iran's ability to move military equipment overland toward the coast limits its capacity to reinforce positions near the strait, regardless of how the diplomatic track with Oman plays out. That's the U.S. military's stated rationale, at least. It's also exactly the kind of justification that becomes harder to verify from the outside once a bridge has already been destroyed and the surrounding area is, by all accounts, still an active conflict zone that independent journalists have had very limited access to. What do you think happens next? Does this Oman-brokered shipping arrangement actually hold, or does this become another temporary ceasefire that collapses the way April's did? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching.